Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Vino da Tavola, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends, and welcome back to another episode. And this one is all about the rebels of the wine world. These are wines or winemakers that have declassified their wines because these misfit wines do not fit into traditional wine regulations or the labeling terms. And yet, they are some of the most expensive, most desirable, or most cult-followed wines on the planet. But before I share with you some of the most interesting wine stories behind these declassified wines, let's just talk about European wine labels for a second. Have you ever picked up a bottle of French wine and seen that acronym, AOC? Or what about with an Italian wine, DOCG? What about German wines, Qualitätswein? Behind all of these acronyms, there is a bigger story, and it is one of tradition, quality, but that is where it can create a little bit of creative tension. So European wine laws are some of the oldest and strictest in the world. If you take France's AOC, Italy's DOCG, or Spain's DO, these systems legally protect where the wine comes from and how it's made. So think of them as the guardians of authenticity. A Chablis must be Chardonnay from the Chablis region. A Barolo must be made from the Nebbiolo grape from a tiny corner of Piemonte, aged for years before release. This is great for consumers because it's protecting heritage, it's ensuring consistency, and it keeps quality high. You know what you're getting and where it comes from. I know, it's a bit like a recipe handed down through the generations. You do not want to mess with grandma's coq au vin. But the issue here is these laws also tie a winemaker's hands. If you want to plant Syrah in Bordeaux, no, it's not allowed. Do you want to make an orange wine in Chianti? Not if you want to use the DOCG or AOC labels. Even if the wine is brilliant, if it doesn't tick the bureaucratic boxes, it will get booted into the lowly category of Vin de France or Vino da Tavola. So on one side, tradition, protection and pride, and on the other, rules that just stifle innovation. Now there is room in the glass for both heritage and heart. Both sides have a glass worth raising, but for today, we will be celebrating those wild, trailblazing and fabulous winemakers that dare to be different. So let's dive into the delicious world of declassified legends. So we're going to dive headfirst into what I believe to be the craziest wine story of the lot. Let me introduce you to Liber Pata, officially the most expensive wine in the world. A bottle of the 2015 vintage was listed at over £36,000. Not DRC, not Screaming Eagle, not Petrus. It's this little known Vin de France, a wine that doesn't even carry the prestigious Bordeaux AOC label. So today I'm taking you inside the story of Loic Pasquet. This is a rebel vigneron behind this insane bottle. And I'm going to tell you why this wine is declassified, why it is controversial, and utterly collectible. So Loic has his vineyards in La Diras in the Grave region, not far from Sauternes. But we need to stop thinking about Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, the Bordeaux varieties that we know and love. Pasquet's mission was to resurrect the lost grapes of pre-phylloxera Bordeaux. For those of you that don't know what phylloxera is, this is this evil little louse, a sap-sucking insect that nibbles away on the roots of vines, and this basically leads to the vine dying. And this was responsible for destroying most of Europe's vineyards in the 19th century. So back then, before phylloxera, there were grape varieties in Bordeaux such as Castet, Saint-Macaire, Pardot and Tannay, names even most sommeliers haven't heard of. And also Petit Vidieu, an old Cabernet Sauvignon clone. He planted these grapes and a few others on ungrafted rootstocks, worked the land with a 150-year-old plough pulled by a mule, and he spaced his vines at insane densities, so up to 20,000 plants per hectare, which is double that of Bordeaux norms. For a bit more context, in Bordeaux, top quality producers typically plant at high vine densities, so often around 10,000 vines per hectare. The rationale behind higher density planting leading to better quality fruit is that closely spaced vines must compete for water and nutrients. And then this competition encourages deeper root development and in turn results in fruit with greater complexity. However, this is more theory than proven fact. But let's get back to why this wine is labelled Vin de France. Because everything Pasquet does breaks the rules. The grapes, the planting density, the pruning, even the fermentation. He ferments in amphora, uses no sulphur, natural yeasts, and harvests by hand with vineyard triage. Now, triage means sorting. In case you're not aware, it's a process of sorting grapes before winemaking. So you select the highest quality fruit, you remove underripe, overripe, or anything that is damaged. Now, the authorities, seeing all of his different practices, told him, nope, you are too non-compliant. So he kind of said, sure, no worries, I'll do it my way. And thus, Liber Pater was born as a Vin de France, which of course is the lowest legal designation. And now in terms of quantities, only 500 bottles of the 2015 vintage were produced. I, of course, have not tasted it, but I know wine critics that have, and reading their tasting notes, they have said that this is a wine that does not taste like Bordeaux. It tastes like time travel, as if it might have been before the 1855 classification ever existed. So the wine is light but structured, savoury, earthy with ancient tension, and not delicious in the conventional way, but haunting. I mean, it is amazing to think that there is a wine that maybe does taste like the history of Bordeaux. Keep in mind, before the 1855 classification, which was this formal ranking of Bordeaux's top wine estates, which was based on price and reputation at the time, there would have been field blends in the vineyards, and grapes would have often been fermented together. There wouldn't have been the modern cellar practices, so there wouldn't have been any stainless steel tanks. There would have been minimum control over fermentation, certainly less oak influence because barrels were used more for storage and transport then, rather than flavour and giving that spicy, toasty vanilla notes. That wasn't normal back then. The wines would have had less alcohol and actually probably most likely more tannin. Cooler climates would have meant that the wines were leaner, more austere. And so these Bordeaux wines would have been lighter, more rustic, definitely 100% less polished. But to have produced a wine like this, it has not been an easy ride. Pasquet has faced court cases, fines, he's had acts of vineyard sabotage, vines cut down, wells poisoned, and his relationship with Bordeaux's establishment is, well, it's not great. But he persists, and in his words, Bordeaux has gone from the altars of the gods to the shelves of supermarkets, and he wants to change that. So, is Liber Pater worth its 5-figure price tag? Well, having never tasted it, I have no idea. I can only assume no, but it is rare. It is rebellious and it is a statement in a bottle. And for collectors, wine historians, and iconoclasts, that makes it priceless, I guess. Now, if I say let's talk about the holy grail of Sauvignon Blanc, but one that doesn't even carry an appellation on the label, does anything come to mind? I want to introduce you to Asteroid. From what I hear, a very mythical wine. This is made by the late and legendary Didier Dagenau and now by his son Louis Benjamin Dagenau. It's one of the most elusive, most expensive and most cult-followed white wines in the world, and yet, incredibly, is not even labelled anymore as Puy Fumé. In fact, it's now completely declassified. So let's talk about why this wine, Asteroid, is so special. First, the production is almost non-existent. We are talking about a wine made only 2 or 3 times a decade in microscopic quantities from just 18 rows of ungrafted vines, farmed by horse. These vines are rooted in flinty soils. They're known as Chirolais in a tiny plot within the La Folie vineyard. Now, this is the vineyard where Dagenau's Pur Sang wine comes from. Expect to pay about 150 to 160 pounds here for that wine. But when Didier was making Asteroid, it was bottled in tiny 50ml bottles. But now you are going to find the later vintages in 750ml bottles, and about 400 of them made in that vintage. Now, having never tasted this wine, very sad, I can only tell you what I have read, which is that the wine of Asteroid is like, and I quote, a barrique version of Pur Sang. Intensely aromatic in the ripe citrus and herbal spectrum with a, wait for it, a chiseled texture, wild tension and stunning minerality. Today, Louis Benjamin is pushing it even further. He's fermenting in glass wine globes, which apparently heightens its purity and energy even more. Now, although Asteroid is arguably the pinnacle of Sauvignon Blanc, it is now declassified. So in 2018, Louis Benjamin formally pulled the domain out of the Puy Fumé AOC in favour of labelling his wines Vin de France. This followed from the 2017 vintage being rejected by the appellations tasting panel. They flagged a vinegary character. However, chemical analysis apparently showed no problems. So I guess knowing that people buy Dagenau, not Puy Fumé, it was like a 2 fingers up to the appellation. This is a domain that's always been about defying convention. Didier Dagenau was this disruptor who revolutionized Sauvignon Blanc. He was most famously known as the wild man of Saint-Andelin. Now, Saint-Andelin being the small town in the heart of Puy Fumé where he was based. He initially went around ruffling so many feathers against his peers as he went against the grain, pushing for really extreme vineyard precision, horse ploughing, biodynamics. I mean, he was the first in the region to convert. Ultra low yields, massal selections, and just this obsessive vineyard care. He was really fanatical about the purity of expression from terroir to bottle. And when it comes to winemaking, there was just no recipes, just constant evolution. Fermentation happens in a mix of light toast barrels or ceramic eggs and wine globes. Now, sadly, as I mentioned before, Didier passed away before his time. He died in 2008 in an ultralight plane crash that he was piloting. And so his son, Louis Benjamin, he took over, but has only elevated things further and certainly followed in his father's footsteps. And the result? Wines that do not just speak of place, they genuinely sing. I've had the pleasure of tasting Silex, Blanc, etc., but sadly not Persang, that's still on my list. And of course, remember this unicorn bottling asteroid. They live in a dimension far beyond great Sauvignon Blanc. These are simply great white wines, period. So if you ever get a chance to find a bottle of this asteroid, expect it to set you back about £1,100-ish. However, any Dagenau wine is magical. Selects is about £160, as is Blanc, etc., which, by the way, was previously labelled as Blanc Fumé de Puy, now reborn as Blanc, etc., and I'm sure you can join the dots as to why. That specific wine is about £100. So now we are heading to Tuscany in Italy, which is arguably the region with the most famous acts of wine rebellion. This is the birthplace of the Super Tuscans. You've probably heard of Sassicaia, the Bordeaux-style beauty that proved Cabernet could rule on Italian soil, or Tignanello, Antinori's bold Sangiovese-led icon that pretty much rewrote the DOCG rulebook. Now, I have already told their stories in detail on a previous episode. So if you want the full Super Tuscan saga, hop over to episode 169. But today we're not going to talk about the coastal rebels. We're heading inland to a different kind of renegade. A man who didn't blend international grapes, but instead doubled down on tradition and ended up making one of the most dramatic exits in Brunello di Montalcino history. We're talking about a very special wine and a very opinionated man, Gianfranco Soldera. He was a force, a man who didn't just make wine, he orchestrated it, obsessed over it, and often insulted everything else in the process. He believed in 100% Sangiovese, no shortcuts, no French varieties, no manipulation, just pure terroir and pure tradition. Have you heard about Brunello Gate? So this scandal rocked Montalcino in 2008. Several producers were caught blending in non-Sangiovese grapes, international varieties like Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, into what was supposed to be pure Brunello. And to say that Gianfranco wasn't happy about this is an understatement. His relationship with many in the consortio weakened as many believed he was the whistleblower behind this scandal, which he always denied. But then in 2012 came the unthinkable. On the morning of December the 3rd, Gianfranco opened his cellar door at Casa Basse and saw literally floods of red wine. Massive oak casks had been opened, 16,000 gallons. Wine from the 2007 to 2012 vintages had been dumped down the drain. We're talking $25 million worth of wine gone in one night. 6 years of work all wiped out. And for a man like Soldera, who rejected modern tech, blended nothing, and aged longer than anyone else, this was the ultimate revenge. Or perhaps it was a statement from those in the consortio that suffered during Brunello Gate. So there were loads of theories thrown around. However, it did turn out to be a disgruntled ex-employee who was found guilty and went to jail. The Brunello Consortio initially appeared very supportive, offering him a certain amount of wine, but that didn't go down too well with such an independent producer such as Soldera. He initially said thank you, but no thank you. Then later on in 2013, resigned from the consortio. So we can only imagine the sort of things that were going on behind the scenes. This was followed 1 week later with the consortio expelling him and taking him to court for defamation. According to the consortio, Soldera had harmed their reputation through comments he made about that offer of wine, as it was published that he had said, not knowing where the wine was coming from was an inadmissible and offensive proposal, a real fraud to the consumers. Anyway, you can read up more on this drama if it interests you. I am sure they will make a film about it one day. But from that day forward, his wines no longer bore the DOCG Brunello di Montalcino label. Instead, he called them simply Toscana IGT. And, well, they sold for even more. So I guess his message was clear. He doesn't need their seal. His name is the guarantee. His approach to viticulture was nothing short of obsessive in the best possible way. He was known to literally taste the soil at Caserbase, believing that to truly understand the life of the vine, one must understand its foundation. For him, nature was not something to manipulate, but to listen to. He insisted that vines have their own intelligence, and his job was to observe, adapt, and support, not control. He once said, "Man is stupid, vines do what they want." And yet, for all his grumbling, he seemed to understand them better than most. And with that, his deep respect for the vineyard's ecosystem led to minimal intervention and an extreme focus on balance and longevity. He also raised funds for children's charities, mentored young winemakers, and in great vintages produced only a fraction of what the vineyard could yield. For 2010, everything went into magnums, and 2 of them raised £80,000 for Room to Read. So, in conclusion, Gianfranco Soldero didn't just make Brunello, he redefined it, then rejected it, and then transcended it. And so if you would like a bottle of this wine, you are probably looking at putting down anything between £700 to £1,000 a bottle. Okay, we are staying with Sangiovese, but shifting gears. We're leaving the rolling cypress-dotted hills of Montalcino and heading north to Chianti Classico, the heartland of Tuscan wine. Now, geographically, Montalcino is more isolated. It's perched on its own little hilltop kingdom. It's surrounded by woodlands, wild herbs, and it's slightly warmer, drier conditions. The wines tend to be richer, deeper, and more muscular. But as we roll into Chianti Classico, the vibe changes. The landscape becomes more patchworked. Vineyards mingle with olive groves. There's medieval villages and forested hills. The soils are different. There's different clones of Sangiovese, and Sangiovese is often blended with other grapes. So it's difficult to stereotype, as it really depends on winemaking practices and the village, the town in which the grapes come from. But I do feel Chianti Classico is generally higher in acidity, slightly lower alcohol, more aromatic, and it has this brighter, sour, red cherry note. So same grape, but completely different expression. Let's talk about one of the most iconic Sangiovese wines to come out of Tuscany, Le Pegole Torte. The irony, it isn't labelled as a Chianti Classico, even though it's made smack in the middle of the appellation. So the story of this wine begins in 1967 when Sergio Manetti founded Montevetine, planting vines in Radda, which is now one of the 9 municipalities that make up the Chianti Classico DOCG area. But back then, however, it was considered too high and rocky to reliably ripen grapes. But that tricky terrain now gives one of the longest growing seasons in Chianti Classico. Manetti wasn't one to stick with convention and certainly was ahead of the game. For a long time, Chianti Classico had to be a blend. Sangiovese was always the backbone, but it had to be padded out with grapes like Canaiolo, which is a local red variety that can give like a soft fruitiness to the blend, and even white varieties like Malvasia Bianca and Trebbiano. That was the norm. Tradition then was codified into law with the creation of the DOC in 1967. Originally, this made practical sense. It was kind of agricultural insurance policy in tougher vintages. But then came along Sergio Manetti, the maverick behind Montevertine. He believed in Sangiovese, pure and unblended. And in the 1970s and 80s, this was borderline blasphemous. The region just wasn't ready for that kind of rebellion. But Sergio didn't care. In 1981, he officially stepped away from the Chianti DOC and carved his own path with Le Pegole Torte, 100% Sangiovese, and proud of it. It was originally sold as a humble Vino da Tavola. It eventually became one of the first true cult Super Tuscans, although Tignanello did come before that in 1971, and was officially upgraded to Toscana IGT in 1998. Now, during that time of rebellion, others were experimenting with Bordeaux varieties and small French barrels, but Sergio doubled down on Italian identity. His wines became cult. Collectors went wild, and suddenly everyone realized that maybe he was right after all. Today, his son, Martino, carries on the vision, and Chianti Classico's rules were finally updated in 2006 to allow 100% Sangiovese wines, but by then, Le Pegole Torte had already set the bar and didn't care. In comparison to the other reds I've mentioned in this episode, this one's an absolute bargain. You can walk away with a bottle for the modest price of just £250 to £300. Practically pocket change. Why not grab two? I wanted to mention one last wine, and so I thought I would take us to the Jura. Tucked between Burgundy and the Swiss Alps, it is one of France's most idiosyncratic wine regions. It's home to old school winemaking, funky oxidative styles, and great varieties you won't find anywhere else. Think Sauvignon, Poulsard, Trousseau, but as your comfort blanket, Chardonnay is planted here too. The wines range from crisp and linear to salty, nutty, and deeply savoury. They produce their famous vin jaune. This is Jura's answer to sherry, aged underfloor for many years. It's a region for wine geeks, nature lovers, and it's typically for people who aren't afraid of a bit of funk in their glass. But let me introduce you to a man called Kenjiro Kagami and his domain des Muroirs. It's one of the most elusive, whispered about, and frankly mythologized wineries in all of Jura. Kenjiro wasn't born in the vines. He was an engineer at Hitachi, a proper tech guy, but in 2001 he packed up his Japanese life, moved to France, and threw himself into winemaking. He trained in Burgundy, doing a stage with Domaine Comte Georges de Vogue, one of the most iconic and prestigious domains in Chamboul-Musigny, before working with the likes of Thierry Allemande. He's from Cornas in the northern Rhone, and Bruno Schuler from Alsace. Now, both of these are titans of the natural wine movement. Then came Jean-François Ganeva, aka Fan, who is based in Rotalier, southern Jura. Now, Ganeva helped redefine what Jura wines can be, this elegant, complex, age-worthy, like seriously deeply alive style, and he personally is known for his cult wines, so also another producer for you guys to look up in the Jura region. But it was Ganeva who was the person who convinced Kenjiro and his wife Mayumi to move to Jura in 2010 and buy a house in the tiny village of Grous. Ganeva recognized Kenjiro's talent and his deeply thoughtful approach to wine, and just knew that this philosophy that he carried would be perfect for the Jura region. Now, the domain name is a nod both to the reflective nature of wine and to his own surname. Kagami means mirror in Japanese, so it's almost like he was destined to be very connected with the land. For Kenjiro, the vineyard is a mirror of the soul. He's not just working the land, he's in conversation with it. Quiet, respectful. I mean, I'm sure this is the kind of guy who is also tasting the soil. Actually, he's probably listening to it as well. So his vineyard is just 3 hectares, although I think now he has 1 hectare more. But this is tiny. And he works it entirely by hand, no chemicals, no shortcuts. He grows mostly Chardonnay and Sauvignon with a little bit of Pulsard and Trousseau. Everything is organic. The wines are vinified in old barrels, aged 4 to 5 years and bottled with no added sulfur. And his wines are selling at an eye-watering price of $1,000 to $1,500 a bottle. These wines aren't labelled Jura AOC, they are labelled Vin de France. But this isn't a choice based on rebellion like many of the others, just simply freedom. The Jura appellation system is traditional and could potentially be restrictive. And so Vin de France gives him room to be, I guess you could say, a purist, to make wines that reflect his deeply spiritual connection to the land. He wants to let the terroir speak softly and slowly over years in barrel. Now, total production for the year is typically 10,000 bottles, and so the scarcity only adds to the mystique. Allocations are minuscule. Most of the bottles go to Japan, a few stay in France, and what's left, I guess it's more of a strike of good luck to come across one. I, again, have no idea what any of these taste like, but I have heard that if you ever get the chance to meet Kenjiro, as some lucky folks have, he's warm, soft-spoken, shy even, and his wines make way more noise than he does. So that just makes me really want to get to know these wines more. I'll leave those of you who are interested too to Google him, and then you can discover his full wine portfolio. And that is it for just a few of the most desirable, declassified, unicorn cult wines. Now, I want to know, what wines did you expect me to mention? I would love to know. There are so many that could have gone into this episode. You can always email me, Janina at eatsleepwinerepeat.co.uk. And remember, Janina is spelt with a J, or direct message me on Instagram at eatsleep_wine-repeat. But before we finish, a gentle reminder, you do not need to drop £1,000 to drink rebellious wines. Take Gran Cerdo, for example. This is a cracking bottle of natural Tempranillo from Rioja. It'll set you back about £14. It's made by, wait for it, Gonzalo Grijalba. Yes, that's his real name. And Gonzalo was refused a bank loan to start his winery, so he named the wine Big Pig as a pointed thank you to the bankers. He refused to play by Rioja's rules, rejecting oak-heavy styles, choosing wild fermentation and minimal intervention. It's declassified, it's proudly unfiltered, and it's exactly what Gran Cerdo stands for, sticking it to the system and tasting great while doing it. But before we go, a wine quote from Albert de Villain, who is a legendary figure in the wine world, co-owner and co-director of Domaine de la Romanie Conti, so DRC. And he said, "The vineyard is a place of contradictions. It requires patience, but rewards boldness. It demands respect, but invites rebellion." So next week, I am excited to say I am kicking off my mini-series on diversity, inclusivity and equity, sharing insightful, heartfelt stories from incredible winemakers, wine pros and educators who are giving back, doing the right thing and truly making a difference. So wine friends, don't forget to like, share, comment and rate this podcast to help it become more discoverable to fellow wine lovers. But for now, drink brave, drink bold, and until next Monday, cheers to you.